Okay. Well, she comes by. I let her know that they picked up her sunglasses and purse, and it's in the church office. We had a little incident this morning at the early service. I don't know if y'all heard about that. Okay, so she may have gotten tied up a little bit, just kind of forgot it, but they put it in those two offices right there at the church. Yeah. So if you happen to run into her,
What happened? Did it just
um,
fall over?
his right hand side, he I think he had a stroke.
Was there a doctor?
There was a nice young man that attended to him and did the right stuff, but yeah, he couldn't move his right side. No. It's it's about as old as I am.
When I lived in New Jersey, I gave it away.
Well, thank you so much.
There, and then he wasn't.
Y'all doing well? Did you watch the game yesterday afternoon?
Best we done.
Yeah, Connor played wonderful. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was catching the ball and popping it up good. Yeah, exactly.
Or the next service.
So good to see you guys. Cheers.
Behind, sometimes behind me, there would be, Doctor, flash. No. Did you get your gel in meetings? Is it cherry jello or is it? Good to know. Oh, did you? Oh, man, you're just living high. Well, so that. Okay.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. The hour has arrived, and those who are drinking coffee can come at their leisure, I'm sure. Uh-oh, Tom, is that what you're doing there? Yeah, but it's broken. I'm sorry. I have the great privilege this morning of introducing our speaker. Is it loud enough? Is it loud enough? Okay. I'm grateful for the opportunity to introduce Tom Ross. Tom is an alumnus of Davidson and of UNC Law School, and he also had the unusual, peculiar privilege of being president of both institutions thereafter. Tom is a lawyer who practiced law in Greensboro, was a Superior Court judge, has done a lot with respect to the courts in this state, and also more recently a great deal with regard to redistricting in North Carolina. Tom has won numerous awards for public service, and he became not only a dear friend of mine, but my personal hero in the way with which he dealt with a somewhat bloodshot Board of Governors at Chapel Hill and showed uncommon decency in doing it all. Tom, we're so glad you came this morning.
Yeah? Maybe that's better. Is that better? Okay, good. Well, thank you, John, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. It needs to be lower, I'm told. So how would I know, you know? But. So I was asked to talk to you about redistricting. And every time I do this, I think it's important to start with some basics because people enter the conversation at so many different places that it's important for me at least to sort of establish a baseline. So redistricting hasn't been with us forever. It's not in the Constitution. It is as a result of a Supreme Court case in 1961, I think, called Baker versus Carr. And before that, there was no requirement that states draw districts at any particular time. They drew them for their congressional seats and often for their legislative seats, but Baker versus Carr came out of Alabama where they had not redrawn districts in 40 years. And the purpose is to equalize population so that you have, under Baker versus Carr, one person, one vote. One person, one vote. That is where it comes from. And so after that, beginning in the decade of the 60s, states were required to redraw their congressional districts every 10 years. And subsequently their state Senate and legislative seats every 10 years. And we think that's still the law, although I'll come back to that at another point. Another term you will hear when talking about redistricting is gerrymandering. So let me take a moment and be sure we're all on the same page about what gerrymandering is. And if this will work. Maybe you did break it, John. Maybe you can just move the next slide for me back there. You think if I took this off you could hear? There. Yeah, I think I might can. Anyway, so this is the definition of gerrymandering. When you draw districts for whatever election district, when one party draws them in a way that they control as many districts as possible, concentrating the voting strength of the other party into as few districts as possible. That's basically the principle. And the two ways that are most frequently used to accomplish gerrymandering are very complex, unusual terms: cracking and packing. So you either pack the voters in one place or you crack them up and put them in different places. And so if you're the Democrats and you want to gerrymander against Republicans, then you pack as many Republicans in one area as you can, and then the rest of them you crack and put into various districts that are still controlled by Democrats. If you're a Republican, you do the opposite. Both parties have done this historically. In North Carolina, we've had now 5 consecutive decades of litigation. And in every one of those decades, the next decade gets here before we complete the litigation. So we're right now still in litigation over the previous 2010 seats, although, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but we're also going to be in litigation now also on the 2020 seats. And this has cost our state millions of dollars over time because the state pays the lawyers on both sides in these cases. And so it is expensive and, in my view, is the most significant danger to democracy that we face. No matter what anybody else says, gerrymandering is the biggest risk to democracy. And the reason I feel that way is because when you gerrymander, you create a situation over time, which is clearly what's happened in our state and in the United States more broadly, where you create safe districts for people, one party to the other. And in that safe district, there's often a primary, often a contest as to who's going to be the representative. And increasingly, the only way, if you're sort of a moderate Republican or Democrat, the only way you're going to lose is if you get attacked from your extreme, on the left or on the right, depending on which party you're in. And so over time, both parties move to their extremes. And that's, in my view, what's happened in America. We've gerrymandered so long and so successfully that we have pushed both parties further and further to the extreme. The other problem is you create these safe districts and people's vote matters much less. So if you're an independent in a state that does not allow independents to vote in primaries, or if you're a Democrat in a Republican-controlled district or a Republican in a Democratically controlled district, your vote means nothing. It doesn't matter because it's all determined in the primary. That's not democracy in my view. And so this is a serious risk to democracy. And so let me stop with that and tell you how I got involved in this. Back in 1981, I was a serial gerrymanderer, something I like doing, gerrymandering, because I was chairman of a local party. They called me from the state party and said, draw our districts. So I got our various candidates together. We met on a Sunday afternoon at a bank. I had a legal pad and I had some numbers and I sat around with the numbers and tried to equalize the population, but I did it in a way that maximized what we needed for our state. So that's how I first got involved in gerrymandering and understood its power. And I'll come back to what happened next, but let me see if I can make these move a little bit. Apparently not. Okay, come back one slide. Apparently I got it too far. So coming back to gerrymandering just a minute, let me give you a little background about that because it does go back before Baker versus Carr. This is Governor Elbridge Gerry, not Jerry, but Gerry. He was governor of Massachusetts, and when he was governor, he approved a congressional map that looked like that. And the Boston Globe had an article about this and called the district, which is sort of in the shape of a salamander, this is the photograph out of the newspaper, and called it a gerrymander, or actually at that point, a gerrymander, because it was named after Governor Gerry. And, you know, what's happened in the future, if I can move the next one, there we go. This is the North Carolina famous 12th district, which was drawn actually by Democrats. This is the 1992 version of that district. And then this is the 2002 and 2010 district drawn by Republicans, the same North Carolina 12th. So both parties, you know, still know what a salamander looks like. We have our own in North Carolina, so we can do gerrymandering. So after Oops, going the wrong way here. I'm sorry, this is not functioning quite as well as I had hoped. There we go. So this is the map that the legislature drew in 2007, the congressional map. And it may be a little hard to see, but you can see in the middle of the state, both coming down through the blue part, and then on where the 12th is, two, clearly what I would call gerrymandered districts, but also the 13th over there is pretty well gerrymandered. The first, you can see how it snakes around into a bunch of different counties. That is a pretty classic example of gerrymandering. So that was in 2011, and of course, litigation started soon thereafter. John mentioned that I left the university. I did in 2016. And at that point, I was asked to come over to Duke and work over there at the Sanford School. And I asked them, well, what do you want me to do? And they said, well, do whatever you want. But you have to teach about it and talk about it. You can't just do it for fun. And so I talked to them about, well, I'm really kind of interested in gerrymandering, and can I work on that? And so they said yes. So for 6 months, that's what I did, and then I left Duke and went to start working in New York. But while I was there, I was required to give a speech because I was the Sanford Distinguished Fellow or something like that. And so I gave my speech. And my speech was about gerrymandering and about the risk to democracy. And that was right after the 2016 election. But before that, and before we moved forward to work on it, while I was at Duke, we did a simulation just to show that districts could be drawn fairly. And so I got together a group of my old judicial colleagues, who I'm trying to get up on the screen here. There we go. And there are two photographs missing, but this is a group of former judges and justices. Without turning around and looking, I know that 5 of the members of this 10 group were former Chief Justices of the North Carolina Supreme Court. One was another member of the Supreme Court. And we had 2 Court of Appeals judges and 2 trial judges. So we had 10 judges, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, that all were retired, well, I think one was still working, but they were all willing to participate in this simulation. So we took them, got them all together, and we said, we want you to draw districts. We broke them into 2 groups, 5 in each group, and we gave each group a lawyer, and we gave each group a map drawer, because drawing the maps is complicated. You have to both equalize population, but you also have to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And so we gave them a lawyer to help them do that. And we said, go draw your maps. Take as much time as you need. And in about 4 hours, or maybe 5, they came back with maps that we then took to Raleigh and ran through the legislative computer to show that they complied with the Voting Rights Act, that they complied with the one person, one vote. And we also asked them to draw districts as compact as they could geographically, which is part of what you try to accomplish when you're redistricting in an appropriate way. We told one group, we want you to start in the western part of the state, which has always been sort of the traditional way in North Carolina, because you get all those counties together and you get enough population and you stop, and then you can move on pretty easily. But we told the other group, we want you to start by drawing a district in Mecklenburg County and a district in Wake County, because those 2 counties are both larger in population than a congressional district. So you're going to have to break up those counties no matter what, and so start there, we told those 2 groups. And then we brought them back together, and we said, let's talk about these 2 maps you've come up with and see if we can agree on a map. And we did, and this was the result. Somewhere, there it is. And if you go back to the 2011 map, I'm not going to try since the clicker's not working quite as well as I would like. you would first determine that the map we drew is much prettier, much nicer. It's much nicer. But it is, you can see, much more compact. Now, the 2011 map, at that point, North Carolina had 13 members of Congress. The result of that map was 9 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And you may remember one of the Republicans who drew it said publicly, well, the only reason we don't have 10 is because we couldn't figure out how to do it. So he pretty well acknowledged that was gerrymandering, which ultimately maybe came back to haunt him later when it went to the courts. But in any event, this map that our judges drew, without regard, by the way, to politics, we did not give them any political data when they were drawing this map. This came out out of 13 seats, it was going to produce 6 safe Republican seats, 4 safe Democratic seats, and 2 toss-ups. So in a red wave year, you might get a 9-4 breakout, just like you did before, or in a blue year, you might get 7-6. So it was a little more even based on the population of North Carolina and the way people vote. And by the way, in congressional elections, if you go back, for example, to 2012, when the election came out with 4 Democrats and 9 Republicans, if I recall correctly, if you took all the votes in North Carolina that were cast for Congress, the Democrats got more votes than the Republicans. And that's happened a couple of times where there's heavy representation by Republicans when the Democrats got more votes. And it used to happen I don't think it ever got to the point where the Republicans had a majority, but they certainly had a bigger piece of the vote than they had number of seats when the Democrats were doing the gerrymandering. So it just shows you that people are not necessarily getting what they ask for when they go to the polls, which I think, again, is part of the issue we face. So as a result of this simulation and as a result of that speech that I mentioned, a number of people said to me, we got to do something about this, and I tended to agree. So we created an organization that was called North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform. And there we go. It's a lot of work to get one slide up. But anyway, that was an organization that I and a couple of other people created. It was co-chaired by a guy named Chuck McGrady, who was a Republican legislator at the time. He was, I think, third in the leadership. He was one co-chair. I was the other. We had a board that was made up of an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, other than a couple of independents that we had on the board. It included people like John Hood, who some of you may know, very conservative guy who now runs the Pope Foundation, but he's been involved with Pope organizations most of his career. Bob Orr, who was a Republican member of the Supreme Court, who's now an independent, who left the Republican Party, was on there. We had, as I say, sort of an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. Former legislators. There was one legislator from Fayetteville who had been the target of redistricting by the Republicans and run out of office as a result. So there were people who had real experience with this. But all of us were committed to one thing, and that is reform in a way that was good for the voters. And we proposed a constitutional amendment that set out certain requirements for redistricting that you had to have if you were going to be successful in drawing fair maps. And they included compactness was one. Maybe move that. There you go. Compactness was one. The contiguous districts, so that you can't break districts up. To not break any more counties than you absolutely have to. There were a number of requirements that we were going to put in a constitutional amendment that, if you follow those, will result in much fairer maps. Because that's the those are the tests that I think most people find to be the fair ones. We worked for a long time to put that constitutional amendment together in a way that everybody could agree on. And then we started working the legislature to try to get them to pass it. And my friend Chuck McGrady will tell you, I think, that we were this close to getting it passed when the pandemic hit. And, of course, the pandemic took all the air out of the room in the legislature. That's all they thought about and focused about was how to spend the money they were getting from the feds and what to do and how to fight over whether we wore a mask or not and how to fight over whether we quarantined and all that sort of stuff. So they didn't pay any attention to anything else, and we lost our window of opportunity. And that was in 2020, of course. So later that year, the Republicans drew a new map. We picked up a 14th seat in North Carolina. And the map they drew would have produced at least 10 Republican seats and 4 Democrats. Again, in a state that population-wise votes about 50-50, but also is made up of roughly 1/3 Democrats, 1/3 Republicans, and 1/3 independents. And the problem, one of the big problems I have with gerrymandering and redistricting in general is it's done by the parties. And if 1/3 of the voters are independents, they're left out anyway, right? Because they don't get any voice. But anyway, that's a different question. So that's why we had the constitutional amendment, though, was to try to protect everybody. So this was the map the Republicans came up with in 2020. It looks to be much more compact, and it is, and looks to be much fairer, but it is pretty heavily gerrymandered to get you to a 10-4 outcome. And it could have been 11-3, or it could have been, I guess, 9-5, but it would be really hard to get it to 9-5. It's really a 10-4 map. As a result of our work, I think, when this map got overthrown by the courts in 2021, I think, and because of our work, I think the legislature used a lot of the principles that we adopted in drawing their new maps, both for the congressional seat and for not for the congressional seat, I'm sorry, but for the House and Senate seats. And in fact, the Democrats and Republicans worked together to draw the House maps that are in place right now. And even though the Republicans won in this past election, 1 vote short of a supermajority, the maps were drawn together, and I think in a transparent way, and are generally fair maps. And I'll come back to how I think that's true in a minute. But can you change that slide for me? Sorry. It's getting too hard to do. This one is one that'll take me a minute to talk about, because what happened after that, they redrew the maps in 2020. One is the case was appealed by both parties, by the way, and by multiple parties. There were a lot of parties involved. The legislature appealed. Common Cause was one of the parties. There were a couple of other parties that appealed. It all ended up eventually in the North Carolina Supreme Court. And in January of 2022, the North Carolina Supreme Court issued an opinion in a case called Harper versus Moore. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that gerrymandering was unconstitutional under the state constitution. And that's important because the year before, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that gerrymandering was a political question and that courts should not be involved in political questions. And therefore, the U.S. Supreme Court essentially said, we're out of the business of looking at districts. We're not going to pay any attention to what you do anymore. It's a state question. But they also said in that opinion, or the Chief Justice said in that opinion when he wrote it, that part of the reason the federal courts should stay out of this is that there are state courts to protect the voters. And that's, again, going to be important if we keep talking here for a few more minutes. But the North Carolina Supreme Court did step in, as Pennsylvania had done, by the way, before the 2022 election, or before the 2020 election, and basically said, the state constitution, equal protection under the law in the state constitution means you cannot gerrymander because you're treating voters unequally. They said in their opinion, they put out a couple of ways you test maps to see, and there's a lot of academics in America that have been working on sort of how can you test maps to see if they are as close to being non-gerrymandered as possible. There's always going to be a little bit of gerrymandering. When I was at Duke, I got involved, a math professor down there who got really interested in this, and he's now become one of those academics that spends his life trying to figure out how to do this. He uses the Monte Carlo theory, which I'd be happy to explain. I understand it in great detail. This name is Monte Carlo, that's all I know. But he can take a computer, and he drew for us, like when we did our simulation map, he drew 10,000 congressional districts using the data that we had given the judges. And he compared those 10,000 maps that he drew that were using our criteria to the legislative map. And he looked at the deviation. And of the 10,000 he drew, and that included the one that we drew, the most significant deviation was less than 2 from each other. The legislative map was at 14 deviations away. That's how dramatic it was. So you look at a chart, you can see this is an outlier, the legislative one. And so that's the technique that he uses. There are a couple of other tests that have been developed, one by some people at the University of Chicago, one by a professor at Utah. And so there are tests, and the Supreme Court mentioned several of those tests and basically set a standard for what is a gerrymandered map and what is not. And then they remanded the case to the trial court, and they told the trial court, you got to draw new maps for the 2022 election. Because there's not time for the legislature to do it. The filing period's right on top of us, so you've got to draw them, and you've got a deadline of February the 1st. This was they issued the opinion on something like January 15th, or maybe a little earlier than that. And so the trial court, in their wisdom, decided that they couldn't do it, that they needed to appoint special masters, which is a technique courts can use. And so they appointed 3 special masters to draw the maps. One of those was a former member of the North Carolina Supreme Court who ran for office as a Republican and continues to be a Republican. The other was Bob Orr, who I mentioned earlier, who was also a former member of the North Carolina Supreme Court who ran as a Republican but is now an independent. And the third was me. And the last time I ran for office was in 1996, and I ran at that time as a Democrat. So there were 3 of us. The little known secret is that we were all in the same law school class. And we've all been friends since we were in law school. And I don't think the court knew that. I don't think probably very many people know that even today. But the only reason I mention it is because it made our work easier. We knew each other well. We don't always agree, but we get along, and so we can work together. So we were given, I was called on a Wednesday afternoon by the court asking if I'd be willing to do this. The court issued an order on Friday appointing me as a special master along with Bobby and the 2 Bobbies, the Bobbsey twins as I call them. It's Bob Edmonds and Bob Orr. So. And we were given until, actually the court was given until 9 a.m. on the next Wednesday. So we were given from Friday afternoon until Tuesday night to do this. So, the first thing I did was find 5 independent experts from around the country that were experts in these various tests, including the originators of most of the tests. And I had to find people who were not already experts on behalf of the parties because they had to be independent. So that took a good bit of time over the weekend to get that nailed down because we needed their help in both assessing maps that we would draw, but assessing the maps that the legislature had already drawn to find out whether they complied with the court or not. So we worked over the weekend getting ourselves ready. I think I went down Sunday night, and we worked, I don't want to say 24/7 because that wouldn't be quite right, but we were there a long time on Monday and Tuesday until we got this done. And where we came out as special masters was that the state house districts complied with the Supreme Court's test and did not need to be redrawn. There was more question about the Senate maps. Frankly, we were all a little bit uneasy about them, but we all felt like they did comply, and the experts agreed with the legislative test. They were right on the line, but they did comply. So we recommended to the trial court that they uphold the state house and state Senate districts. We, however, found that the congressional map did not comply and was out of compliance with the Supreme Court's rules that they had set down, and so we had to set about drawing a new map. What you have up here now is the new map that we drew, and this was the map that was used in the last election in 2022. When we drew the map and we did the analysis of it, we felt like that it would create 7 safe Republican seats, 6 safe Democratic seats, and 1 toss-up. And the outcome of the 2022 election was 7 Republicans were elected and 7 Democrats were elected. In the 7 Republican races, there was not any race that was close. In the 6 Democratic races, there was not really any race that was close, just as we showed with the data. The one race that we said was a toss-up was in what we drew as a new district number 13 around Wake, Johnston, and Harnett, a little bit of Wayne County. And that was a hotly contested race, and it ended up 49 point something to 49 point something. And the Democrat won it. It was very close. And so I think where the masters came out was drawing a set of districts that reflect North Carolina's voters pretty well, because that's about how North Carolina voted, is 49-49, you know. However, since this map was not drawn by the legislature is entitled to redraw it under the law, and they will be doing that later this year. The maps are going to change dramatically, I can assure you, for a couple of reasons. First of all, and I hate to even say this because I spent 18 years as a trial judge and would like to think, and I believe I had the reputation of being completely non-political as a judge, and the courts should be non-political. But increasingly, the courts have a reputation of being political. And there has been a change in the registration of the people that now occupy the North Carolina Supreme Court. It was 4-3, made up of people who were Democrats. They're the ones that issued the decision last January. It's now 5-2 Republican. And most people feel that the court's decision of last January may be interpreted slightly differently by the new people. They've actually said that already. So there's a lot now going on with all of this. One of the things that's going on is the legislature will redraw the congressional maps at least, and they're entitled to do that. As a technical matter, they're not entitled to redraw the House and Senate districts because they approved them and the court approved them. But they have now filed, the legislature has now filed a petition with the new Supreme Court asking the new Supreme Court for a rehearing of the January 2022 Supreme Court case. If that's allowed, it would be way beyond the norm to go back and rehear a case that was heard a year ago and has had its appeals exhausted because the U.S. Supreme Court took the case. I'll come to that in a minute. It's now before the U.S. Supreme Court, but not on the issues of the maps, on a different issue. So it would be highly unusual to do a rehearing after a year. The chance to file that motion for rehearing is time limited in most cases, so this would be out of compliance with the rules. But a lot of people think they'll hear it and overturn it. And if they do, then the legislature will be back in business to do all the gerrymandering they want, with the only restriction being oversight by the court. But they now think they got the court, so they don't have to worry about that, right? So you got a map now that produced 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans in North Carolina. My bet is that in the 2024 election, I don't care who's running for president, I don't care what the outcome of the election is, you're going to end up with at least 10 Republican seats, maybe 11. And there was not much that's going to stop that, in my view. So you all are now mostly, if you live in this area, mostly represented by Jeff Jackson. I will put money on the fact that he will not still be in Congress in 2 years. I think there are a number of people that are there now that won't be there because they'll be redistricted out intentionally. You know, no matter, I don't know which side of that you're on, it doesn't matter, but that's what's going to happen. So let me put one more slide. Can you change that to the next one up there, please? There you go. So Harper versus Moore. This is the case where we said it's special masters. I've talked about the Supreme Court decision. I've talked about the trial court and the special masters. I've talked about the fact that that was all then reappealed to the Supreme Court. That's been heard. It was also appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court on a completely different theory, which is the independent legislative doctrine. The independent legislative doctrine is a doctrine that was first developed by a group called the Federalist Society, which is a conservative lawyers group. I would say somewhere between 95 and 100% of constitutional legal experts who are not partisan one way or the other believe that the independent legislative doctrine as advanced by the Federalists is nuts and is completely can't think of the right word. It is so far unrelated to the basis of our republic and the way it was formed and at the time it was formed that it can't possibly be real. However, the U.S. Supreme Court has accepted our case in North Carolina to hear arguments on the independent legislative doctrine. What it does, or what the argument is, by the legislature in our state and the Federalists and those who support this doctrine, is that the independent legislative doctrine gives state legislators complete, absolute power over federal elections without any oversight by courts or anyone else. Complete, absolute oversight of federal elections, which means there would be no way to attack or appeal any gerrymandering they do. There would be no way to attack any, and this applies to federal elections, not necessarily to state elections. You could still challenge those, I suspect, in state courts. But in federal court, you wouldn't be able to challenge, for example, a literacy requirement for registering to vote. You couldn't challenge a limitation on the number of polling places down to one place that's only open 3 hours a day. I mean, if they did stuff like that, you couldn't challenge it. It would be because they have absolute power under this theory. Now, why is it so out of sync with the rest of the Constitution? Is because the very basis of our republic was checks and balances. We built our government around the fact that there was always a check and a balance. No one had absolute power in any place. There's always a way to get one of the other branches of government to overrule something that another branch does, one way or another. It can be done through the courts. It can be done through legislation. So it is just not in sync with the way our government is created. And I think it's if our U.S. Supreme Court adopts this theory, this is my opinion, which isn't worth much, but I believe our democracy will be gone within 20 years. We will not have one anymore. That's how dangerous this theory is, and I think there are a lot of constitutional experts that agree with me that it would create such havoc in federal elections that the chances of the democracy surviving. We're already on the fringe because of gerrymandering. You know, for example, the U.S. House now is close, right? I mean, you're going to see, again, no matter who, this is my opinion, no matter who is in the presidential candidates are and who wins and who loses, the Republicans are going to pick up seats next time. Why? Because they're going to pick up at least 3, if not 4 seats just in North Carolina. And there are other states that are in similar situations that were gerrymandered, and then the courts intervened, and if the independent legislative doctrine's adopted, or just from the fact of changes in who's in control, that's going to happen. And yet, you know, if you look at the voting across the United States, that's not where the country is in terms of its breakout. So I talked about the motion for rehearing before our court. So all this is going on. The motion for rehearing in the North Carolina Supreme Court should be heard, you know, within the next month or so or two, I would guess. And if they decide to rehear the case, you know, that will definitely happen before the legislature acts to redraw the districts, which they're going to do for the congressional seats at least. If the North Carolina Supreme Court throws out the previous Supreme Court's order, the legislature may try to go back and redraw the Senate and House maps as well, under the theory that, well, they were approved only under this bad case, this bad criteria. So we're free to go back and do what we want. And of course, if the independent legislative doctrine applies, they can redraw congressional districts no matter what. And again, that'll be true all across the country. That's what will happen in the North Carolina Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court case has been argued and will be decided more, as is normally the case with really important cases. It'll come down the last week of June. So we'll know then whether they've adopted this or not. You know, it's going to be really interesting because I mentioned to you that Chief Justice Roberts, in his decision saying the federal court shouldn't be involved in gerrymandering, said part of the reason was their state courts to protect the voters. Well, if he votes for the independent legislative doctrine, then he has just undermined his own opinion. So a lot of people don't think he will do that. They're pretty sure that there will be at least 4 of the justices that will vote to overturn the independent legislative doctrine, and at least 3 that will oppose it. And that the 2 key votes will be Roberts and Kavanaugh. And based on the hearings, at least from the people that, you know, were there that I've talked to, they do not think the Supreme Court will go down this road. I sure hope not, but one never knows. And so Alito is the big driver of this case. He's the one who wants to see it put in place more than anyone else. And he has a lot of influence on the other conservatives on the court, so we'll see. I think there's not much question what's going to happen in North Carolina. Well, no matter what the Supreme Court does about the case, they're going to redraw the districts the way they want, and there won't be any successful challenges to them because they won't be able to win in the new court. So I think there might be one more slide, but that might be the last one if you just punch and see. Yeah, that's all, except we're at the church. So, yeah, so we have a few minutes, and I'd be happy to answer questions. Yeah.
Michigan and 4 or 5 other states have independent commissions, and I know Michigan's had trouble keeping people on it. It was supposed to be a 3rd Republican, a 3rd Democrat, a 3rd Independent, 1 from each congressional district, I believe. But the claim there is that the independent legislature commission, or theory says that makes commissions illegal, even though it was an amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, it will. For federal elections, it will make those irrelevant.
Okay.
Yeah, for federal elections, they'll be irrelevant. And there are a lot of states that have commissions. Some work better than others. we thought about that in our group. Should we create a constitutional amendment that would force an independent commission, and decided not to for lots of reasons, because it is virtually impossible, in my view, to get people to agree on how to appoint the commission. If you're a nerd about this issue, as I am, and you go look at how California selects their commission, it is the most bizarre thing I have ever seen in my life. It is like people can nominate themselves or other people can nominate them, and all the nominees go to the state auditor, and the state auditor develops a list that then the legislative leaders get a pick from, and then somebody else has to approve it all. I mean, it's just like, takes forever. But the commission seems to be working okay once they get them, you know. Other states, most states, well, let me go back. There's another Supreme Court case. There was a challenge to commissions about whether they could be truly independent and the last voice on this issue, as opposed to recommending something to the legislature, because this is a legislative responsibility at its core. The U.S. Supreme Court said yes, the legislature can delegate this to somebody else and never be involved again, and that's the way Arizona's commission works. One of the longest standing commissions has been in Iowa, and it makes recommendations to the legislature. But it's been there so long and it's so well accepted that the legislature rarely tampers with it, although they did last time, you know. But commissions are one possible solution. We decided that setting parameters and rules about what you can do and transparency, those are really the two keys to this, transparency and rules, is a better way to eliminate it. But that's where we are. Yeah.
Tom, can you comment on the politicization of the courts? Have they always been political from the get-go way back?
You know, I guess they could have been, and maybe I missed it, but in my career as a judge, I don't think there was very much, if any, criticism of our courts in North Carolina, or really, I mean, there would be occasional criticism of the U.S. Supreme Court where people would criticize around a particular decision. You know, there was a big movement against the Warren Court, you know, because it was, you know, too liberal and that sort of thing. It wasn't really party criticism as much as it was liberal conservative criticism. But in the rest of the court system, federal and state, we didn't go down that road until 20 years ago, I guess. When I was at the foundation, we worked really hard to get nonpartisan elections in North Carolina in the judiciary, and we were successful. Unfortunately, when the legislature changed hands in 2010, all that got repealed quickly. So we now have partisan elections, and I think we're seeing the results of that, where the public perceives the judicial now as partisan. And I think that's really sad because, again, it for years, most of our history was seen as the independent branch that wasn't political and wasn't supposed to be political, and it's not supposed to be. But unfortunately, I think it's turning that way more and more. I mean, there's an article in the paper this morning, or not in the paper, but somewhere I read about the current Chief Justice of the North Carolina Court wants to change 2 rules, which basically will give the Supreme Court the ability to decide which cases the Court of Appeals hears and which cases the Court of Appeals decides that have any precedent. Now, why does that matter? Well, Court of Appeals, though it has more Republican judges than Democrats, the panels sometimes get mixed and, you know, they make decisions, and the Supreme Court doesn't like them, they can just say, well, that doesn't have any precedent, or you can't appeal that, you know. It used to be if there was a split decision at the Court of Appeals that somebody wrote a minority, then it was automatically appealable to the Supreme Court. They want to get rid of that so they don't have to hear. It takes away the power of the minority voter on that, which they believe is political usually, which is not, I don't think, but that's what they think, I think. So that's another effort toward this. You know, when I was the administrator of the court system for a while, and you know, that was seen as a kind of civil service job running the court system. Right now that's become a very political office as well, in my view. So it's not a good time for the courts or democracy or any of those things that we care about. Yeah.
Two-part question. First of all, more humorously, what's the good news? Don't these parties see that this is actually dangerous to democracy?
I'll take the second one first and say yes, that I think both parties recognize this is a bad practice. And yet neither would want to give it up unless they were afraid they were never going to be in power again, right? So when I first paid attention to this issue, well, let me put it this way. Art Pope, who is a very conservative person, he and I known each other a long time. We don't think alike, but we agree 100% on this issue. Because when he was in the minority in the legislature, the Democrats were master gerrymanders. They weren't as good as the Republicans are today because they didn't have computers, you know, and they also weren't allowed to break precincts like can be done nowadays. So you can go down to a single household now when you're drawing maps and actually cut a house out if you want. And that's what happened to the woman in Fayetteville. They literally went across the street, took her house out, put it in a different district. So but both parties are guilty of this, and both parties know how bad it is. But when the Republicans were in the minority, they were in favor of changing the system. The Democrats were opposed to it. Now, the Republicans are opposed to it, the Democrats are for it. And the reason we had a chance in 2020 to change this was nobody knew who was going to win that election. It was a little bit of a moment in time when we thought we could get it done. Well, now we don't have much chance to do it because they don't think they're going to lose, the Republicans. So they're not going to change their mind about this. And what's the good news? The good news is I think Americans are more aware of the risk to democracy today than they were 5 years ago when, or I guess it's now been 7 years ago when I first started working on this issue. More people are aware of this issue, but they're also more attuned to the risk to democracy. And part of that's because of what's going on around the world. I mean, we see democracies at risk in lots of countries now, and I think so Americans are paying a little more attention, and I think that's a good thing. But I don't know if it's enough. And I don't know what percentage of the people in this country both understand how important a democracy is to us or really want one. So, yeah.
When did this idea of deification of the Federalists come in? And I see this as a great danger, originalism.
Yeah.
Trying to worry about what people 100 and some years ago thought when you can only travel about 15 miles a day.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, the Federalist Society started, I think, around the time I was in law school, and nobody paid much attention to it. And it's been sort of growing over time since. Its influence is now incredibly significant. People will tell you that members of the Supreme Court can only get there under a Republican president if the Federalist Society recommends them. And that's certainly true of the last four appointees, I think. So they have a lot of influence now. And originalism is interesting. You know, it's one of those principles that is good when it helps you and not so good when it doesn't. So in the independent legislative doctrine, you will find only, or at least I've been told, you can only find one sort of piece of evidence from our founders that supports the theory behind the independent legislative doctrine. It's a letter written by one of the founders which has been proven to be fabricated, and 100% proven to be fabricated, and yet it's still being used in the briefs and all that, which is kind of bizarre to me. But in other words, there's no evidence at all supporting the theory that they have, and yet, so if originalism really mattered, then you know, the members of the conservative part of the court wouldn't be here in this case. And there are other examples in our judicial history where, you know, originalism works for one outcome, but if it doesn't work, then they ignore it and go to a different outcome, you know. So it's just it's a way of analyzing cases, really, and some people are more religious about it than others. But Yeah, I don't know that, tinkering like that matters in the long run. Let's suppose you did. Let's suppose the Democrats increased it to 12, pack the court with 3 more Democrats so that they had a majority, right? The next election, a Republican president wins, 2 people die, it gets switched back, I mean, it's not a solution that's going to be healthy for America, in my view. I mean, it's kind of like gerrymandering, I mean, if you're a Democrat and you're in control and you're gerrymandering, it's a great thing until you lose, and it's just. I don't think the courts were very political, and I don't think the public thought they were because they were elected on a nonpartisan basis, but that's not the case now. So, okay, yeah, one more, yeah, sorry, yeah,
Amusements if you need
yeah.
to leave.
No, I don't need to leave. I just think we're getting close. Other people are getting up, so I didn't know.
When the string bean went from Charlotte to Greensboro, I think,
Yeah, it did.
maybe,
It actually went all the way to Durham originally from.
I don't remember which time it was.
Yeah. 1992, it went, when Mel Watt was first elected, it went from Charlotte to Durham.
Okay, an observer editorial commented that if you drove down I-77 and 85 in the right places with both doors open on both sides, you could kill all the inhabitants in that section. And Davidson, in one of those splits, got split in 3 ways, either at Main Street, Concord Road, or at Walnut Street and Main Street. I don't remember which. My neighborhood was split. And one of my neighbors, a couple blocks away, their house was split. So they go to vote and discover that the husband and wife are in different districts.
Yeah.
So they simply said, if we sleep on the opposite side of the bed.
Can we vote twice? Yeah. Yeah.
Also happened in the president's house, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm not going to ask you which one went over. Let me mention one other thing real quick, just because I think it's a good example of gerrymandering. The cracking example is in the 2020 drawing of the maps. The legislature drew a line right through the middle of A&T's campus in Greensboro, right through the middle of it, and put half in one district, half in another, which, if I didn't mention this, but one of the other principles is called communities of interest, trying to keep communities of interest together. Pretty good example of that not being the case there. So, but thank you. I appreciate it.